Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture in the Australiana Fund's 2023 lecture series. We're delighted to offer these lectures to members, supporters and friends of the Australiana Fund and other organisations that we reach out to involve. My name is Caroline Johnston and I am on the National Council of the Australiana Fund, Chair of the Events and Marketing Committee and Chair of the Victorian Committee. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the peoples of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm zooming this evening. I'd also like to pay respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. As we're in a Zoom meeting tonight, I suggest to enhance your viewing, you put yourself onto speaker view so that you can see our speaker speaking and also the PowerPoint presentation that Tim will share. And it would be great if you could keep yourself on mute until the end of the lecture. We are recording this tonight for later use. If you'd like to ask a question during the talk, please send them through by clicking the chat button. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the lecture. The landscapes and gardens of the official residences that we support, Government House and the Lodge in Canberra and Admiralty House and Kirribilli House in Sydney, are intrinsic to the identity and character of each of the houses. Whether it's the famous Vista Lawn at Government House, graced by Clement Meadmore's sculpture Up, the native garden at the Lodge created by Mrs. Bettina Gordon, wife of Prime Minister John Gorton, or the breathtaking views of Sydney Harbour across picturesque plantings surrounding Admiralty House and Kirribilli House, the residence's heritage garden settings are as important to their significance as is their architecture and interiors. Tonight, we're really delighted to hear from distinguished botanist and a renowned Botanic Gardens director, Tim Entwisle, about his career and his new book, Evergreen, the Botanical Life of Plant Punk. He will be speaking on a life in Botanic Gardens. Tim has been Director and Chief Executive of Royal Botanic Gardens since 2013, following 2 years in a senior role at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and 8 years as Executive Director of the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust in Sydney. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Tim Entwisle tonight. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the lecture. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you all for the invitation to speak. This is a great delight and such amazing places that you're interested in yourselves, and I'm hoping I'll share a few of equal interest with you tonight. I'd also acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples and pay my respects to their elders past and present as well. Look, this is a story really about my life thus far. And so it does include, I always put a warning at the front, it's going to include pictures of me. And it's a little bit hard when you publish a memoir and you give a talk on what you've been doing to avoid that. And it sort of it gives a bit of context. You can see me be sort of growing up through the talk, which is either highly amusing or highly relevant to what I'm saying. But either way, please excuse the multiple pictures of me at various times. So I'm going to talk today about sort of basing it on the book, as Carolyn said, Evergreen, the Botanical Life of a Plant Punk. Here we go. And I wanted to start just with the front cover of the book. I'll come back to this in a moment, but you can see there, published by Thames Hudson. And on the left side is one of those little things they do on the web where they pull out the words, and the more commonly the word is used, the bigger it appears in print. They used to call these wordles, I think. And you can see in that list at the left, I think words like Australia, collection, algae, plants, Melbourne. Later, interestingly, I must have used the word later a little bit more often than I should have. Sydney, trees, writing. And so you get a sense really of what I'm talking about, but it is very much a book about Botanic Gardens and my life in Botanic Gardens and really what makes them, sort of interesting to me and why they're important today. So when I started writing the memoir, I was trying to think how I would start this book, and it came to me eventually that I would start in Padua. Now, I visited Padua in 2018. It's not far from Venice, a short train trip out of town, and it's the site of the world's first modern botanic garden. Now, I say modern because it's very difficult to determine when botanic gardens began, but let's say they began in 1545. There's a couple of gardens in Italy actually around that time, even a couple of years earlier, but they're not in the same place where they originally began. So the one in Padua is considered the oldest botanic garden in the world today. And when I went to visit there, I was reading a book, and that was an Australian book by Robert Desay called Night Letters, A Journey Through Switzerland and Italy. And in that book, on the chapter on Padua, which you get to very much later in the book, he has this paragraph. He says, make no mistake about it, what was beckoning me from beyond St. Anthony's spires and domes was nothing less than the recreation of paradise. Now, Robert Desay writes this book as the narrator. It's really almost a memoir, but it's about a trip through Italy. And he's sitting having a coffee opposite the Botanic Garden near St. Anthony's. But he says, but I turned away. I didn't go. I just sat there with my cappuccino. And I thought glumly about how I didn't believe in Edenic visions or regained innocence, nor did I believe that the Orto Botanico, the Botanic Garden, had much to do with nature. It was a book about nature, encyclopedia of nature, not nature itself. And with that, off he goes back to Venice, and he doesn't bother crossing the road to see a botanic garden. Now, I expect most of you on this call would cross the road to see a botanic garden, so you're possibly not in this category, but it did intrigue me as to why he wouldn't go. And I thought, well, maybe we're not doing things right. Why would someone not go to the oldest botanic garden in the world? Why are botanic gardens important? Why do I think people should visit botanic gardens? And that gave me a sort of a theme to run through the book, at the same time as talking about what got me as an individual interested in botanic gardens and why I ended up as a director of a couple of some of the most amazing botanic gardens in the world, I think. So that was my theme for the book, if you like. And of course, I did cross the road. I did go into the Padua Botanic Garden, and this is what the centre of it looks like. It has a medicinal collection of plants right in the middle, and it began as a physic garden. So it began as a garden showing off the plants that people use to heal, and which is what a physic garden is, and then grew into a sort of more modern botanic garden. It's a lovely place, by the way. It's worth a visit. It's an old-fashioned botanic garden in a way, but very much worth a visit, despite what our Australian author said. So with that, I talk a bit about botanic gardens, but then I start to go back into my own life and sort of look at the formative parts of that. And I started to think about what got me into plants. And initially it was contact with nature. And I did a few bushwalks, and one quite famously for myself, at least, in 1982, when I walked part of the Western Arthurs in southwest Tasmania. And it's an amazing walk, but it's quite difficult. It's a 10-day walk, and there's not really tracks, at least there weren't at that time. And when we got into the walk, it was in November. Just a few days in, it started to snow. We got caught in a rock crevice. Three of us had to sort of hide ourselves inside that rock crevice. It wasn't really a cave. And we stayed there for about 5 days. Now, we were university students. We weren't really trained in looking after ourselves. So what did we do during those 5 days? Well, we ate our 10 days food supply for a start because we had nothing else to do. So we sat there eating. And then at the end of the 5 days, we'd eaten all our food for 10 days. Now, quite clearly, I did survive, or I wouldn't be giving you this talk. But it was an interesting place to be, an interesting set of circumstances to be stuck in a cave inside the mountain, effectively, on the Western Arthurs. Luckily, the sun came out one morning, the snow started to melt, we were able to walk off the mountain range, and we got back to safety. But it did put me off going off into the remote areas for bushwalking. So I still bushwalk occasionally, and I do day trips and a couple of days, but never a bushwalk like that. So I thought, look, I do like nature, but I don't have to go out into the most exposed, most rugged places to see nature. I figured you can see nature in a park, you can see nature in a garden, you can see nature on your balcony, you can see it in a crack in the path. So nature to me, I realised, was everywhere and not just in remote places like the Western Arthurs. And maybe that has something to do with where I was born, which was Nil, and this is Nil Hospital, where I began life. I only spent a couple of years in Nil. my parents were teachers and they both moved around quite often, went to Euroa, Wangaratta, various places. But I spent a couple of years here in Nil, where it's probably not renowned for its gardens, of course, although there is the beautiful little desert nearby. From there, as I said, we did move around the state, and this is me with my father taking a dip, probably in a creek near Euroa, I think. And I like to think this is where I came in first contact with water and rivers, which will come up later, as you'll see. The other thing my father was interested in, besides taking us out to creeks, was basset hounds. And we had a couple of basset hounds. At one stage, we had 9 very young, small basset hounds. And the very first garden I recall was in one of our rental houses, and it was mint, just a thicket of mint growing at the back door. It had cyclone wire fence around it. And I wasn't quite sure if that was to keep that mint in there to stop it getting out, or it was to keep these things, these very large dogs when you're a small child, from getting to the mint. Quite possibly both, but that was the first garden memory, is just a patch of mint by the back door. From there, of course, I have seen many more gardens, and this is the Melbourne Gardens. This is my mother taking one of my brothers, who was just born, through the Botanic Gardens in 1966. And in this year, my father sadly died. He had asthma, he had bronchitis, and had been unwell for a very long time. And he'd come to Melbourne to get some advice, some health advice on what he should do. And one of the bits of advice I think he was given, my mother suggests, is to spend more time in parks and gardens. So in this year, sadly, he died, but my mother, of course, took up that advice and took us for a walk in the Botanic Garden, at least. My mother soon remarried and married a lovely man who became my stepfather, and he was an artist, a commercial artist. So we get these lots of birthday cards and lots of illustrations of us as we were growing up. And this is me as a teenager living just out of Castlemaine in a place called Yepeen. So we were still living in the country. When we first married, we did go down to Melbourne for a little time, but my stepfather was very keen to get back to the country, and that's where he thought he'd like to live. And of course, my mother was very happy there anyway. And this was my bedroom at Yepeen. So this is the place I chose to live in, and actually studied my last couple of years of secondary school in as well. So as soon as we found this place, there was an old weatherboard house to the left, and I thought, this is going to be my bedroom. The word Athelas on the front will not only mean something to people who are diehard Lord of the Rings fans, which I was at the time, and I was quite obsessed with that book, reading it over and over at that particular age. So that went on the front of my little bedroom. The other thing I was a bit obsessed with was maths and physics. So I finished school, state school, really quite interested in doing maths and physics. I went to university and I filled up the first year with mostly kind of pure maths, which I was interested in, and physics as well. But I had to do one small extra subject, and that small extra subject, I thought, look, I might do botany. My father grew plant seeds, and he, went into pots, and I'd helped him growing those. My grandfather used to take us for bushwalks around Castlemaine and looking for gold, as it happened, which incidentally we never found, but nevertheless it was good to go out and seek it. And I thought I'll do a tiny botany subject. I'd never done botany before that. I hadn't done biology at high school. So there I was in the botany school at Melbourne University. I distinctly remember a picture of a plant cell being put up on the wall, and just being absolutely amazed that the plant cell, well, first the plants are made up of plant cells, and then inside each one were all these tiny little bits and pieces, all, the nucleus, the kind of the DNA of the cell, these chloroplasts that were going to soak up the sun and produce energy, all that sort of stuff. I say I knew nothing about. I was told later by a teacher that I must have done some biology at high school, and I couldn't possibly not have known plants are made up of plant cells. So there you go. Either my memory was very bad, or I never learned it till I got to university. So botany sort of won me over, And in second year university, I just switched entirely to studying botany with a little bit of genetics. I didn't have to do any zoology, interestingly, at Melbourne Uni. You could just do botany, and I just filled my next year with botany. Now, that was all very well until I got to third year. And part of botany is studying algae and fungi and things like that. And we had a fantastic lecturer in algae, just like we'd had in botany. I think that's what drew me into plants originally. Then we had this great lecturer, a guy called Jerry Craft, who taught us all about algae. And we had to do a little project. And a lot of people went off to the sea. They were scuba divers, and they would go diving, or they were surfers who wanted to spend time on the coast. I thought, well, look, I kind of like creeks and rivers and walking. So I went off and I've looked in a creek, and I found an alga growing on a rock that had not been found before in Victoria, and turned out to be a new species. And I was just amazed by that you could find that out. And I was obviously a science student, and if you're a scientist, finding something new is what sort of drags you into a subject. So these pictures are pictures of algae, and I just want to point out that they're quite beautiful. And the stuff on the rock there is like a little seaweed attached by a holdfast, tiny little holdfast. So these are growing in a creek in the southwest of Tasmania, and you look down and you see them. They're sort of slippery, slimy. They're actually called batrachospermum, which means frog's eggs. So they're a little bit like frog's eggs in texture. And when you collect them and look at them under the microscope, you see on the bottom left there, they're a bit like a bottle brush with those little fruiting structures, the round dark circles there. And then all of the algae are quite pretty under the microscope. That's the thing. They might not look much in the field when you collect them, but when you take them back and you look under a microscope, there's a whole world opened up. And that one in the top left is what's called a desmid. And desmids are very small plankton. They float around in the water. This one in Yan Yan Reservoir. And just look how pretty that is. You can imagine seeing that sort of floating past in a microscope slide. So I was finding something new. I was discovering things. And that for a young scientist was, as I used to tell people at the time, a bit like Joseph Banks coming to Australia, looking for plants, stepping off the Endeavour at Botany Bay, and then seeing his first Banksia. And now he wouldn't have seen this Banksia, as it happens, because that's from Western Australia. But putting that to one side, these beautiful Banksias and this beautiful flora that he discovered or found for the first time for Western science, that's what I was doing in rivers. I was going out, collecting, and then bringing it back and discovering things never seen before. Very, very exciting, and I could work on those and describe them as new. And this is all it took. This is, I like to say this was an early selfie. So I stuck my camera on a rock and I went and posed. And this is what I looked like when I went off collecting algae. You can see all I needed was a pair of thongs and shorts, a hat, of course, to keep the sun off, and a feather so that I looked a bit jaunty, and then a bottle to put the algae in. So it was very easy to do, very enjoyable, and so I could mix that, love of walking, not to the Western Arthurs, but love of walking, and also that love of finding things new and using microscopes. And when I got back to the laboratory, it also took me to many other beautiful places, Bathurst Harbour, again, southwest Tasmania. This picture was on a trip with Dick Smith, who took us in his helicopter and dropped us into various places. We almost got back to the Western Arthurs, actually, but the winds were too high and we couldn't quite land there. And it also took me further afield. I got to places like Sweden, Uppsala in Sweden. And the reason for that is when you're describing new things, discovering new things, plants, anything really, you need to make reference back to the original collections or early collections or collections of plants in other countries. And in this particular case, there was a Swedish algal specialist who'd been sent material from Australia and New Zealand, as you can see here. And you can maybe able to pick out the word batrachospermum there on that list. And he looked at those, he thought they were new, he put some names on things, but he hadn't ever formally published them. So I needed to go and look at those collections, firstly to find some things from Australia, actually, to places I might not get to, but also to compare them with the other things he'd seen, to see whether our flora here was different or the same as overseas. As it turned out, about 80% of the red algae, which is what we call these, even though they're not red, so I'll just have to believe me on that for the moment. These red algae where 80% of them only grew in Australia or New Zealand. So they're very like our flowering plants or like our marsupials with all that, the distinctiveness of our flora. So I was studying algae and working in that area for quite a while. And eventually, though, I needed to get a proper job. So I was working at the university. I did a postdoc. I started to work a bit on the Yarra River, actually. And I was doing ecological work in the Upper Yarra. But then a job came up in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. And in fact, I had a bit of history there. I'd worked there over the university holidays, mounting herbarium specimens. I'd worked there for about 9 months as a horticultural assistant, so getting a bit of an experience with the gardens and doing record keeping particularly, so more about the records than it was hands-on gardening. And I eventually worked in 3 botanic gardens, and I'll just take you through those 3 botanic gardens through this talk, because these are 3 of I think, the great botanic gardens of the world, very impressive gardens. There are many more as well, which I'll mention too. And at Melbourne Gardens, I grew up. I had quite a family. So Linda there in the top right with my 2 children, Emily and Jerome, who are now in their early 30s and living just out of Sydney or in Sydney. And then at the bottom right, we published the flora of Victoria, because the job I got at the herbarium was a flora writer. So not doing algae, but working on flowering plants. And when I applied, I said, look, I work on algae, but I like all kinds of plants. I've done botany, I've worked in botanic gardens a little bit, and it's the same skills. I can transfer those across. And they thought that was convincing enough to give me the job. So I started to learn all about the plants of Victoria. Particularly, I got very interested in things like orchids at one stage, and Linda and I often go off looking for orchids, and these are a couple we saw in Western Australia called flying duck orchids. And, just the most amazing flowers and pollination systems where insects and wasps pollinate these flowers. So what was really exciting about that is that I was getting paid, if you like, to look at and spend time with plants both living and in the herbarium, which is the pressed preserved plants, and to study and learn so much about the plant that I could then write an account of it, a description, and also a key to how to identify it. So it's like being a perennial student, but actually being paid. So I was really quite excited by this role, and I did some writing. Then I got into editing. And we did things like put on conferences at the same time. So the Melbourne Botanic Gardens turned 150 while I was there in 1996. And we put on conferences celebrating Ferdinand von Mueller, the first director of the gardens, but also one in the middle there called Beyond the Floras. What would we do when we'd finished doing that flora I was working on? So already we were starting to think, what's going to come next? And at this time, this was just when computers were just creeping in. So we weren't quite sure what would come next. Now, from Melbourne, a job came up in Sydney. Now, one of the things that also happened in Melbourne, in addition to becoming a flowering plant botanist, so moving from algae to flowering plants, but still doing some algae on the side. So they were quite happy for me to keep doing that. I got interested in management, and I think I always wanted to be the boss. I thought there's always, when decision-making came up, I thought, I'd like to be the person who can make that decision. And perhaps I didn't like being told what to do. I'm not sure. But I have realised, as everyone realises at some point in their life, that you are never the boss. Even as a CEO today, I have a board, I have a minister. And of course, you always respond to somebody. Government responds to the people who vote them in. So it wasn't quite perhaps what I was expecting, but I did enjoy being part of decision making. I enjoyed really being involved in things, and I got a job in Sydney as head of science, and that meant that I could keep doing some algal work. I could keep getting involved with flowering plants to some degree. And I started to do more talking about them. And I did some writing and some radio about plants. And this is a particular favourite, the Angraecum sesquipedale, horrible name to say, but the Star of Bethlehem orchid. It's from Madagascar, so it's not an Australian orchid. But the great thing about this, just in passing, is you can see that long green tube there, a nectar tube. There's a tiny bit of nectar at the bottom of that. It's nearly a foot long, so 30 centimetres long. And Darwin discovered or was shown this orchid. He didn't discover it, he was sent it. And he said, there must be an insect out there. And it's going to be a moth just by the colour and the shape of that flower. And it will have a tongue or a proboscis that is long enough to get to the end of that tube. That's the only way it would work in an evolutionary sense. He knew there were flowers with smaller nectar tubes, but none this big. And he said, there's got to be something out there. At the time, no moth was known that had a tongue that long. Yet, 20 years after Darwin died, in Madagascar, a moth was discovered with a proboscis 30 centimetres long enough to get to the end of this nectar tube. If you're worried about it flying around, how does it do that? It spirals up its tongue, so it really carries it in a little spiral, and it's much easier, and then it releases that down into the bottom of the nectar tube. So fascinating, predicted by Darwin because he knew there would be an insect out there that could pollinate it. I also got involved in other projects which always seem to have a bit of promotion slant to them or a communication slant to them. We had a seed bank there, as there are many seed banks around the world, and there's one in the Botanic Garden I run today. And while I was there, we did a project called Seeds in Space, which was great fun. We sent some seeds, 5 packets, up into space, onto the space station that orbited around the Earth. I went around 2,800 times. When the seed came back, we planted it, we put it next to seed that had stayed on Earth, and we wanted to see whether the micro radiation, whether sort of the microgravity as well, or tiny gravity, would they have any effect on the seed? Would they behave differently? And the result was no, absolutely no difference between the ones on Earth and the ones that went around the Earth 2,000 times, 2,800 times. So the science was not that interesting in that sense, but it was good to know that seed banks would survive, if you like, if we had to put seed into space. But also what was interesting and more useful, I think, was the connection we made with the astronaut. And you can see in there, he's showing the seed to students back here on Earth. So we had senior school students who would connect up and could ask him questions live, and we could get them to talk about seed banking and why seed banks were so important. So it was really more important for communication than it was for science itself. We also had the Wollemi pine, which was auctioned off that year as well. So the very first Wollemi pines I discovered a few years earlier, were growing a couple in the Botanic Garden. But while I was there, we had the Sotheby's auction where people were paying $1,000 or more for one Wollemi pine. Now, they're still a little bit expensive, perhaps, but you might recall when they first came out, they were quite expensive. But these were the first ones to go into people's gardens, and that money went into conservation for national parks and the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. And it also got those plants out into people's gardens and created a sort of distributed plant collection, which was part of what we wanted to do. We wanted to back up the plants in nature and make sure that that species would be looked after. And as I said, I started to do radio and talking, and I got a regular spot on ABC Sydney. They hadn't done plants before. They'd had talks about animals. They'd had various sort of chats, and someone live from a hospital as well. For the first time, they did plants, and I would just do it by phone mostly. And this time, I went into the studio, but I just talked for 5 or so minutes about a particular plant in the Botanic Garden, and that was a great way not only of promoting plants, but also the Botanic Gardens at the same time. Now, it wasn't always fun, and I should point out that being a director of a gardens, as you'd probably imagine, has its ups and downs. And this was a down while I was in Sydney. A big, long story, and in my book, it takes up a whole chapter in the middle, so I won't go into the gory details, but those of you in Sydney may recall, we had some fig trees, about 10 fig trees in Hospital Road, which is in the Domain, that needed to be removed. So they come to the end of their life. They were starting to lose limbs. They were on the edge of roads, in a park. We couldn't fence them all off. And you couldn't really replace them by planting another tree nearby and waiting for this to die. It doesn't quite work that way with avenues usually. So in any case, there were a couple of people unhappy in Sydney, including the Lord Mayor at the time, who's currently still Lord Mayor. And we ended up in court. We ended up winning, because partly what I was saying at the time publicly was we're a bunch of tree huggers in the Botanic Gardens, and so we really didn't want to take them out, and we knew that it was the right time to do it. And if I didn't do it, I knew that they would sit there waiting for the next director. So I felt fine doing this. It was a good test, if you like, of being a director. I'd only been in the job for maybe 2 months, I think, when this happened. And the Lord Mayor suggested that I be sacked from the job on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And a commentator on radio called Alan Jones thought that I was a fat, lazy bureaucrat. So it was a testing, but I was happy to be supported by my staff and happy to know I was doing the right thing. And I was told at the time by a politician that you should always do this kind of thing when you start off in a job. It means that everything after that is going to be smooth sailing. And mostly it was. I got to see lots of botanic gardens, both in all the places, all the jobs I've had. I already showed you pictures of Uppsala, but the garden in Edinburgh, I think, is one of the best in the world. I think if you've got to look at a garden for its horticultural standards and its plant collections, many from China, Edinburgh is just a beautiful botanic garden. And there are many places that are not botanic gardens that are beautiful as well. The Eden Project in Cornwall is a really thrilling place to visit. And a lot of people are attracted there who don't particularly like plants or gardens. So it brings people in and gets them interested in plants when they might not think they are. And that's always a good thing. That's partly what I think botanic gardens should do as well. And that's get people excited about plants and understand why they're important to us. And the Eden Project, which is an old China mining site and has been converted with these great domes so they can grow tropical plants and all kinds of exotic plants in Cornwall, which isn't actually so bad in the UK anyway, but it's just a great idea and works really, really well and attracts a lot of people to Cornwall, in fact, as a tourist attraction. And China, there were not many botanic gardens in China. They're now quite a great deal. There were about 100 or so built over the last couple of decades. There's lots of gardens, of course, but the botanic garden concept came later. This is in a glasshouse in South China Botanical Garden in Guangzhou. And it's just an amazing collection and an amazing place to visit as well. So a lot of the botanic gardens in China are now becoming some of the best in the world as well. And I was still collecting algae. Here I am in Katherine, 2008, collecting my freshwater red algae that grow on those rocks. They're red in the sea, by the way. I talked about them being red algae. So when you go on the coast and you see red coloured algae, they're red algae. But in freshwater, some of those pigments are washed out. So you get left with the green. So it's interesting. They're still related to those red algae, but they're often green or brown or different kinds of, sometimes a purpley colour as well. While I was in Sydney too, I did start a bit of thinking about Australian seasons. I ended up working on this for my next job and then published it when I got back into Melbourne. Again, it's probably a subject for another talk, but the main point here was that we really miss out on something when we don't have our own set of seasons in Australia. The 4 seasons, the Vivaldi seasons, they often call them, don't work so well in lots of parts of Australia. And of course, it varies from tropics to down to Tasmania and the mountains and coastal areas, and it's different in every place as it is in many countries. But I think in southern Australia that we certainly have an early spring, and so I set up a system which is sort of the inner layer there, it's the outer layer, Sprinter and Sprummer. I thought we had an early spring called Sprinter, I called it, and then a late spring called Sprummer, and then a much bigger, longer summer season as well that goes for 4 months, and these little short autumns and winter as well. So look, I devised that system. I think eventually we should use the Indigenous seasons in Australia. They vary from 3 to 12, and they would be different every time you got out of your car or you walked or you rode or you got on a plane, and they would reflect the place you're in. And I don't think until we better reflect and understand where we live, we could really understand and respond to things like climate change as well. So I do think seasons are important, even though they don't determine the way we do things in life. And in all the jobs I've had, there are great opportunities to meet people. I talk about a few of these in the book, but this is me with a guy called William from the UK, Christina Keneally, and myself in the Domain. And, the Domain was one of those places, because it's near Parliament House, near the Opera House, near the bridge, there were always people passing through. And that's also true of my next job as well. But before I get to my next botanic garden, this is a painting done by my son called Being and Nothingness. He wanted to, this is for his HSC. He's now a barrister, by the way, so he's moved on from art, but he wanted to do a board office worker. And so he thought I would be the perfect model for that. So, you know, here I was thinking I was doing grand things in the Botanic Garden and you know, a botanist and all that kind of thing. But really I was the board office worker that my son saw each day when I came home. Nevertheless, this is what he painted, and he put that in his HSC exhibition that got into David Jones in Sydney. But another artwork at the time, which got perhaps a little bit more attention, was one by Hayden Wilson, who's an artist from the Blue Mountains. And this is a painting called Proclamation. It's based on a Henry Lamb painting. And the proclamation in Henry Lamb's painting is a proclamation about writing, I think. It's a painting of someone in the Bloomsbury set. The proclamation in this picture, apparently, according to the artist, is me proclaiming nature is important. And behind me in the distance is a Wallamai pine. There's a thing called Chrysophyllum imperiale in the front, the big leaves there. It's a Brazilian plant I used to love in the Sydney Botanic Garden. So there's some lovely elements in there, and it's a strange pose. And it does, in the book cover, you'll see it sort of sits opposite the title, which is The Botanical Life of a Plant Punk. And it's, you know, it's an interesting picture, and I quite like that on the front cover. That took me off to Kew. So just before that even got put in the Salon de Refusé, which is the sort of second rung, the ones that don't make it in the art gallery. I didn't see that hung. I whisked off to Kew to another job that I was quite keen to try, because working at Kew is such a great experience. And this job came up to look after Kew Gardens, the horticulture and landscapes, Wakehurst Place as well, the second garden, the Millennium Seed Bank, which had 50 seed scientists and curators in it as well. The estates, which is another name for all the old buildings, many of them in Kew, and conservation and conventions. They did a bit of policy work. So it's a great kind of job, like being a mini director at Kew, but not being the director. And had a great time there. And I did some kayaking on the Thames. So one thing I have maintained through each of those careers or jobs is kayaking. I quite like it, and I started in Sydney on Sydney Harbour, then on the Thames, and now I do it back in the Yarra as well. This is near Teddington, not far up from where we lived in. So we were living in Kew Gardens, I'll get to in a moment. Very cold in winter though, and I would say, you know, I'd come back from the paddle with only a few fingers having feeling on one of my hands or both of my hands, but nevertheless, very beautiful place to kayak. And we didn't live in this palace. This is Kew Palace, for those who've been to Kew Gardens. And just to the left of Kew Palace is this place. You can see Kew Palace in the background there, and you can see this old Georgian residence where we lived, a two-storey place. We lived in the right-hand side of that, and it's our garden to the right of that hedge. And to the left, in fact, is where I kept my kayak. I kept my kayak in the kitchen of the other house as well. So this used to be a gatekeeper's cottage. It's from about the 1750s, and it was a housekeeper, sorry, not a gatekeeper, the housekeeper who worked in a place called the White House, not the White House in US, but the Lighthouse in London. And that White House was a building next to Kew Palace, and it's also where royalty lived for a little while as well. So a lovely place to live, and great to be part of that Kew environment. This is my office, and again, another fantastic view across to the wonderful Palm House. And, you know, the seasons that I saw changing in London helped me to write that book on seasons. I got a sense of what perhaps those original 4 seasons were like, and I could compare those back to Australia. I also got to spend time in some beautiful glass houses and with some beautiful plant collections. This is the Victoria water lily in my favourite glass house, actually, the water lily house. It's only quite small. It holds these water lilies. It also holds the world's smallest water lily at the very back there, a thing called Nymphaea thermarum, tiny little, quite rare lily as well. So this was a lovely part of Kew Gardens. Now, many of you may have seen Kew Gardens, perhaps less of you have been to Wakehurst Place, their second garden. So that's like Cranbourne Gardens here, or Mount Annan Gardens and Blue Mountains Gardens up in Sydney. And it's a beautiful garden around an old homestead, and the garden is set up to sort of to reflect and sort of connect with that old homestead. But there are also parts of the estate that are more natural, or at least as natural as it gets in the UK, with these lovely yew trees. So this is also part of that botanic garden, the same way that there is natural vegetation in some of the botanic gardens around Australia. While I was there for those few years, we had the Chelsea Flower Show, and we actually had a garden in Chelsea Flower Show at Kew, and we brought that back to Kew for a little while. We were there for the royal wedding, but I unfortunately didn't get an invitation to that one. We were there for the Olympics, and I was in Sydney for the Olympics and in London for the Olympics, and enjoyed them both more than I perhaps thought I would. I'm not a particularly sporting person, apart from my kayaking, but you can see there in the bottom right, in Kew, we could put those rings, the Olympic rings on the lawn. And why that was so successful is because if you fly into London and you land at Heathrow, you cross over Kew Gardens, as I can attest. Planes come over every couple of minutes on some days, and it's one of the downsides of living at Kew Gardens. This is quite noisy during the day. And there was the Diamond Jubilee while I was there. These are odd pictures just to explain them. There's a top and a bottom half of this picture. The top half is the Royal Flotilla going down the Thames, and we rushed off to see that. And we got to the edge of the river, and I looked across, and there were just people everywhere. So we'd come much too late to be able to see anything. So all we saw were the back of heads on the bottom picture, some with cardboard cutouts of the Queen on the back of them. And I had to hold my phone up above my head and took that picture at the top. So the only views I saw of the Thames and of the flotilla were what I looked at in my camera later on. So it wasn't much of an experience, but it was great to be part of the crowds and great to be there in town. Also meeting other famous people, in this case, David Attenborough. So David Attenborough, and when I walked up and said hello, and he said, "You're from Australia?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I am. You recognise the accent?" And he said, No, it's because you're wearing a beanie and a coat in a glasshouse. So I was obviously still adapting to the climate of Kew when we met up. And having the opportunity to go around the UK, to visit Europe, to do lots of travelling, some beautiful places. We ended up only being there a couple of years, but places like this, my favourite hedge, which everyone should have a favourite hedge, and this is in Wales, and it's many hundreds of years old. And you can just see it's gradually formed into that beautiful sort of organic form. It's just an amazing hedge near an amazing castle. But look, after 2 years, though, we did come back to Melbourne. This is the last little part of the talk where I returned to Melbourne. And the reason for that really was we wanted to return sometime anyway, Linda and myself, and our children were here in Sydney, in Australia. And also, when this job came up, the director here had been here, Phil Moores, had been here 20 years. So I thought, look, if I don't take this job, it may not come up again for a little while. So we moved back to Melbourne. I was lucky enough to get the job of the garden I perhaps love the most in the world, a really spectacular, beautiful garden with a connection to me right back to when my mother was walking there with my brother as well. And of course, since I'd gone, the Cranbourne Gardens had been created and opened, the Australian Garden, a beautiful modern botanic garden. So I had perhaps the most beautiful heritage classical garden design, and this wonderful Australian garden out at Cranbourne that people love so much and has won so many awards. And while I've been there, we better add to that. So I'm not going to go through all the things we've done over the last 10 years, but certainly we've built a new arid garden, which has got lots of attention, a very beautiful garden based on a collection of cacti that we got from a place near Echuca, a private collection of someone who'd collected a lot of material, or their father, in fact, had collected this material from the Americas in the 1930s. He paid money to get people to go and collect, bring it back to his house. He grew it up, passed it on to his son passed it on to us, and we created this wonderful garden. Andrew Laidlaw, the landscape architect, who did this, as well as many of the new landscapes at Melbourne Gardens. And we had famous people plant trees. We have lots of commemorative trees in the gardens, mostly kings and queens and governors general, that kind of thing. But while I've been there, we've had a couple of others, and Nick Cave, the musician, was one that I was quite keen to get. He planted a lime tree reflecting one of his songs. So I was trying to find somebody who might reflect something interesting about Melbourne and its cultural life. That was really the goal with that. And I do put this one in just to remind me that the reason for the plant punk part of the title is that I do have bad taste in music, and I have to confess to that. So I do still like quite noisy music, and the main reason for that title is it's a provocative title in a way, and certainly the cover shows me with a tie, with a a very classical pose. And I think being a director of a gardens gives you the opportunity to do interesting new things, but also to make sure you look after that heritage and the important parts of the garden. So if you get that right, you have this wonderful mix of, I often call it nature, culture and science together. So it's been important to me in a botanic garden to bring all those together. And while I've been at Melbourne, we've had fire gardens, a wonderful display of fire in the gardens, which was quite scary in one sense, but done very safely by a French company that had done this many times before in gardens. And then last year, Lightscape 2022. I know this is running in Sydney and in Perth this year. We're running it again here in Melbourne, and it's selling very well again in Melbourne. It's not part of another festival, so it's sort of a different situation to what's going on in Sydney, but it's really a great way to bring new people into the gardens. And we found last year that about a quarter of the people had never been to the gardens, botanic gardens before. Another quarter had not been for a long, long time. And since I've been back, that's that picture I showed you of the younger Tim Entwisle with the flora of Victoria. We now, of course, have moved on and we're putting that online. Just let me. So you can see the Vic Flora is now, as it should be, available electronically. So excuse me for that. And we've also put a horticultural flora online as well. So we're starting to provide that information electronically. I've also remained really keen on doing publicising plants, publicising gardens. And I did a show on ABCRN called Talking Plants over 2 summers. 6 series in each of those, 6 episodes. And that was great fun. It was a lot of hard work though. So I realised that perhaps it was a bit hard to run a gardens and also do a show like that. But I love doing that. And I continue to do work with Blueprint for Living on Saturday mornings every now and then as well on Radio National. I did get a seaweed named after me. And I must, I have to put this in here because it's a red alga, to remind you that some algae are red. It grows in the sea though, it's quite rare. It was named Entwisle Bella, the beautiful Entwisle, which is meant to be the seaweed, not so much myself, but nevertheless a really interesting alga, quite distinct, and it's even its own family and its own order. So it's a very, very unusual seaweed. But what's even more unusual is that when Henry Bucks came to the gardens and wanted to create some ties, we did a deal with them. We thought they could use images from the herbarium press plant collection. They could make ties and they would give us a percentage of that. And the one they picked 2, in fact, both were algae. And these little light blue spots, which are very like pom-pom balls, that's actually Entwisle Bella. And you can see me wearing the tie, you can see a bow tie. Maybe most people won't pick it, but I did when I saw this picture in the paper a few months later. And this is Alan Finkel. And you see the most interesting picture, or the interesting part of this picture, of course, is the tie he's wearing with Entwisle Bella on it. So that's real fame, isn't it, when the chief scientist wears your tie? So I'm getting very close now to the end. Just a few pictures of it. I've kept going to Botanic Gardens, California, the giant redwoods. I've been able to get to places like Chile to see monkey puzzle trees growing in nature. And I just have to show you what they look like close up, those trees. So these are Araucarias related to Norfolk Island pines, to hoop pines. And they look like that. They're covered in lichens and mosses, big, grand old trees. So wonderful things to see. More recently, I've had my first chance to see cacti growing in nature. And this is in part what we're trying to reflect in our new arid garden at Melbourne Gardens, as well as these masses of columnar cacti and just the beauty of those and the colours in those. Also to China, I mentioned before, I've been able to go back to China a few times and see probably some of the original ginkgo. So that's a tree that's almost went extinct around the world. It was known from fossils and only discovered more recently, or been maintained and then grown into cultivation. Planted everywhere, of course, and an amazing tree, but very few in China are thought to be natural. I went to one of the places where that's thought to be. And then, botanic gardens are great places. And I thought this is a picture of a parterre, of course, a classical garden, but also with modern sculpture. So this is a little place in Lisbon, and they bring those two together so nicely. But if I had to pick another of my perhaps favourite botanic gardens, I mentioned Edinburgh, I mentioned Melbourne, I mentioned, of course, Sydney and Kew, but Kirstenbosch under Table Mountain in Cape Town is just a spectacular garden. Again, beautiful horticulture, wonderful South African plants. And I have to pop this into Gardens by the Bay, which is not a botanic garden and not your classical sort of garden setting, but so many people come to this, so many people who perhaps wouldn't go to a botanic garden go there, that I do think it's doing what a botanic garden does, and that's inspiring and exciting people about plants. And when I got back to the gardens here, we celebrated our 175th. Do you remember I was here when we were 150? So I went away, came back in time for the 175th. Unfortunately, we had a virus around at the time, so we didn't do a lot of publicity, but we did have a tram decked out to celebrate that occasion. And I've even got longer hair, as everyone did during COVID, I think. My son continues to be a barrister mostly, but to do cartoons occasionally. This is now what I look like, apparently. So from being a board office worker, I'm now sitting at my computer tapping away. And I do that for various purposes. Today, I keep a blog going called Talking Plants. So I quite like that name from the radio show and continue to use that name for various things. And that's where I sort of keep up to date and do weekly posts. And also I'm writing for Gardening Australia magazine. So I really enjoy that promotion side of the gardens. And as director of the gardens, it's a great opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of the plants, on behalf of gardens. And writing, I've obviously just written this memoir, and I do plan to do a bit more writing because I'm finishing up at the Melbourne Gardens in about 6 weeks, actually, on the 3rd of August. And I've got a fascination with oaks. I got really obsessed with oaks during the pandemic. I'm not sure the publishers are quite as obsessed as I am, but one day I'll get something published about oak trees. And let me finish just 2 more slides here. Just a reminder, coming back to the book, and it covers some of that territory I've been talking about, starting, as I said, in Padova. Has that chapter about the figs in the middle, and the first part about how I got into botany, the second part about those 3 botanic gardens. But I thought I'd finish just sort of to round off where I started, and I talked about that Robert Dese book. And by the end of the book, I hadn't really expected to get to this point, but I thought, what is it the Botanic Gardens do today? And I thought, well, maybe this will keep Robert Dese happy. We could reclaim the name Physic Garden, medicinal garden, and Botanic Gardens could be seen as a cure for the world ills. So I think the thing that's changed is the Physic Garden is no longer a collection of medicinal plants. The Physic Garden is every part of our Botanic Garden, every part of our garden, every part of our balcony, every plant that grows anywhere. That's the healing power of plants. My grandson, who's now nearly 6 years old, he's 5 there.
Thank you so much. That was just such a wonderful lecture, hearing about your journey with plants, your journey with gardens, and all the things that you've got up to, and your beautiful pictures to accompany your words. Really, we're very delighted that you could join us, and that was just a super lecture. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Carol.
Now on to questions. So let me just pull up on my screen. If you have any questions, please bring them through. I'm going to start off though. Tim, you may or may not be aware that the fund itself has both acquired various art objects, sculptures, which are already in some of the gardens, and we've been recently commissioning quite a few which are joining the gardens of the official residences. I'd be interested in your thoughts about art in Botanic Gardens, and perhaps might mention the Chaluli beautiful glass sculptures that were at Kew, which I was lucky to see. But your thoughts generally on art in Botanic Gardens and gardens generally?
Look, I think they go together beautifully, and I think art and cult, that's why I'm quite happy having events on, as long as they don't distract too much, and you try and put them in the evenings or you make them temporary. And Chihuly glass is just, I didn't see it when it was at Kew, but I've seen a little bit in the Missouri Botanical Garden, and I've seen it in various places, and it is spectacular, very expensive, and that's why you don't see it too much in Australia. But it is temporary as well, and I have come to think that's pretty important in Botanic Garden. You have a few permanent pieces sometimes, and they have significance often, but there is a tendency to fill the garden up with sculpture, and I think it can very quickly become a sculpture park. And there's nothing wrong with sculpture parks, and I love them. The Yorkshire one particularly, I think, is fantastic in the UK. But as a Botanic Garden, I do really feel it's temporary is great, and temporary could be a year or a couple of years if it's the right piece. And if you had Chihuly there, you're probably happy to keep that for quite a long time. But the plants have to be the thing that they have to sit amongst the plants, and often getting artwork created for the site is important if you can too. And I've seen that happen at Kew Gardens as well. But again, I like it to be temporary, but I do think art and gardens work perfectly together. You just have to keep the focus on the garden.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We'll keep on. We do have some questions coming up and some comments. Somebody who recently visited Darwin's Botanic Gardens and saw a 4-metre python lounging in a tree. Does Sydney or Melbourne have unusual wildlife in the gardens other than the possums and the bats?
Yeah, well, that's a very leading question. It doesn't have the bats anymore, but has the possums still in both gardens. We do well at Cranbourne Gardens in Melbourne. We have wallabies and kangaroos and koalas and snakes and all kinds of interesting things if you're on the lookout for them. In Melbourne, it's just occasional fox and mostly possums, but lots of bird life. The thing that you do get in gardens, particularly good gardens that are very diverse, and one of the benefits of having lots of different plants is there's different kind of habitats. And there's about 110 different bird species in Melbourne Gardens. And going out to Cranbourne early in the morning, it's just a cacophony of bird sounds. Very, very beautiful. And it's the same with the Sydney Gardens and, Kings Park and all the gardens around Australia. So no pythons. The closest we got to a python in Sydney was a bag of python poo to try and scare the bats off. And it didn't work, I have to say.
And I imagine you've been to some of the official residences. I perhaps wonder whether you make commentary if you have, and what you see is some of the beautiful features of the gardens that are highlighting the house and how they sit together. So perhaps if you can talk a bit about those, both the official residences, but also your experience around the Melbourne Government House and the one in New South Wales.
I know I've seen a few of the houses in the gardens, and I think you've Hobart and Sydney and Melbourne, and I think in Perth as well, maybe in Brisbane too. And I think they're great opportunities to create a garden that fits with the house. What's interesting, just comparing Sydney and Melbourne a little bit, is Sydney's garden does nestle around the house, and the lines of it and those plantings reflect the sort of the doorways of the house. What's interesting in Melbourne is we have a garden that's created by William Guilfoyle. Now, William Guilfoyle designed the Botanic Garden, and he also designed the garden at Government House. We don't look after it anymore, but the design is still Guilfoyle. And if you go into Government House in Melbourne, there's a big area, kind of parking area around it, and then the garden around it, which is quite beautiful and is as beautiful as the Melbourne Gardens, but probably almost distinct from the house or disjoint from the house. There's on one side it's a little bit more connected, so it's an interesting. It's so beautiful that you sort of get away with it in inverted commas, but it probably doesn't connect to the house. But then I'm thinking, and down in Hobart, I remember doing a tour of the Government House there, and it's a lovely garden. It's got some beautiful old trees, and the landscape broken up into bits and pieces, and that's probably more, a garden like the one in Melbourne is of a single piece, like the Melbourne Gardens itself, and that's distinctive. But the collection around Hobart, there's a tennis court and there's some old trees to one side, and there's an orchard over, a public orchard people can go into. So I think they, like a botanic garden, they should reflect the history of the place, and they should reflect that building and how they connect to that in a really good garden of that kind.
Thank you. And from Jennifer Sanders, the chair of the fund, great botanical tour, she says. But what do you think are the challenges for botanic gardens in the future, and especially in the context where many new housing developments, not at the gardens, have less room for gardens, let alone trees? Would you like to just talk about the gardens in the future, botanic gardens?
It's quite sad. Probably a lot of us think that some of these developments where housing is packed in so tight and there's less gardens, and I like to think they create not only botanic gardens, but some small spaces, even more like a London or some of the suburbs where you have these. And I think, funnily enough, this work on suburban rails and level crossing removals in Melbourne can actually add some extra green spaces. So I do think we've got to start thinking about those in between all these housing developments. But for a botanic garden like the one that's at Mount Annan, the Australian garden, or like the one at Cranbourne, they now sit as oases. The Cranbourne garden, we've also made sure that there are connections, not as big as we'd like, to be honest, but connections between the Cranbourne gardens and other bits of native bushland, so the animals can connect between those. Your koalas and your bandicoots can run up and down those or climb up and down those. So they do become important sanctuaries for wildlife and plants. They also become what we found at Cranbourne during the pandemic is a whole lot of people discovered they had a botanic garden, and they didn't seem to know it was there because our numbers have gone up, nearly doubled since before the pandemic. And everywhere else, we're still waiting for people to come back to Melbourne. But at Cranbourne, the locals found they had a garden within 5 kilometres or 10 kilometres. So those of you living in Melbourne will know we had very severe restrictions for a time. And they discovered the garden. So they're a green space, but they're more than that. And there's a bit of work done on the diversity of plants being really healthy for us. They help, they make us sort of think the variety. So not just having a lawn, you need more than they need the variety of plants. So that's, I think botanic gardens can add that extra layer, sort of park plus, if you like, in these places. And in those new areas, even more important, they're going to look back. That's going to be the Centennial Park. Mount Annan will be the Centennial Park of that area.
And those of us that were locked out of gardens really missed them, and lucky people at Cranbourne. Tim, it seems to me you've had some really special highlights in all of your jobs. What do you rate as your greatest achievement in which could be in any of the gardens among those?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that at the moment as I get ready to leave this garden, and probably my last CEO job in a botanic garden. And I really wanted, when I started here in Melbourne, to make the garden more outward-looking, more connected to the cultural life of Melbourne, as well as doing the science and conservation. Because you've just heard I'm a scientist, and you can see what drew me into this. But I do think botanic gardens are at their best when they do all those things together, which sounds like a challenge, but science, conservation, a cultural place, a connection to nature, and I think. Well, I do know what I've tried to do in Melbourne, and what I've tried to do in all the botanic gardens I've worked in is to make that stronger connection between the garden and the broader community. And that might be through radio or writing, it might be through talks, it might be through just, what we do in the botanic garden, in the displays, and making sure it's accessible. Somebody said the other day they thought I'd democratised the garden, and I like that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that fact that it's a garden for everybody makes me feel quite happy. It's not an exclusive place where no one goes.
I think you should be, I agree with those comments. I think, the garden is very much more accessible, and all those wonderful activities that you've had there as well are bringing in people that didn't know about it. I think that's a perfect place to end. Tim, really, we've been so delighted with you speaking to us tonight on all of the work that you've been doing in those gardens, and you've really given us a wonderful journey, as I said, on your life and your gardens. Now, really, I'm sure everyone's joining us thanking you, and I'd also, we really deeply appreciate your time tonight and your preparation. And thank you to those at the Australiana Fund who worked to put this lecture together behind the scenes. And we will, I think, email everyone details of your new book, Tim, and where they can buy it if we can work with you on that. And I think that'll help everyone that's out there that is now totally fascinated and keen to see it. This lecture will be published through YouTube on our website at some stage later, and everyone who's been on the lecture will know about that. So that's also good. You know, for everyone out there who wants to join other lectures, you can book through our events page, and also, you know, look at the website on our collection too. There are lots of things there that you might not realize we have in the collection, and our wonderful book, Collecting for the Nation, is also available. So yes, back to Tim. Terrific to have you with us tonight. I hope, you know, your future endeavours work really well for you. We'll be interested to know what they are. You've seriously got a lovely range of activities that you've had, and I'm sure that there'll be no end to what you're going to write about or do in the future. And as you said, you know, nature, culture and science is the combination, and make sure that's accessible. So you've done that to us tonight. You've obviously done that with the gardens you've been involved in. Thanks so much. I'm sure, and we've had wonderful feedback on the line about it. So thank you very much, Tim, and good night to everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful to speak. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn.